All right. Well, if you've been with us on Wednesday nights, we've been looking at the book of Acts, working our way through the book of Acts. When we last left Paul, Paul was on his second missionary journey. He was last time in the city of Athens. Some remarkable things happened in Athens. Paul there preaches his great sermon on Mars Hill, and so we left Paul there in Athens. We're going to pick up tonight in chapter 18 where we left off, 18:1, and Paul is going to move from Athens now to Corinth. Now, I gave you a map. And I gave you, and hopefully you picked it up. It was on the table out there by your Bible study sheets. And it's of the second missionary journey. I gave you a map earlier of that, but I gave you this one in particular, and I didn't pick up a copy of it. Lisa, let me see your map for a second. I gave you this primarily because it has the different Roman provinces color-coded in different colors. And so you can see, he comes through Galatia, and you can see it's green, and then he travels through Asia Minor, and you can see it's yellow, and then he's going to travel over to Macedonia. He gets the vision from the man from Macedonia, come over to Macedonia and help us, and he travels to Philippi and Thessalonica, and tonight he's going to be in Corinth. Now, what province is Corinth in? You see it on your map there, right? You can't say it? Achaia. So I wanted you to have this map because sometimes you're reading along in one of Paul's letters and he says something about the churches in Macedonia, and you're thinking, where is that? Well, you've got the map. It would be areas of Thessalonica, Philippi, Berea, that area. And then sometimes he's saying something about the churches in Achaia. Okay, if he's talking about Achaia, he's talking about Corinth in that area. So, if he's talking about Galatia, then he's talking about that area west of there in what would be modern-day Turkey. And so, hang on to that map. It will help you not just in studying Acts, but if you're studying any of Paul's letters and he makes reference to Galatia or Macedonia or Achaia, and you scratch your head and go, well, where is that? That map will come in handy to know where he's talking about. All right. Okay, so let's dig in. Paul's in Corinth, second missionary journey. Verse 1, chapter 18. After these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth. He found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who recently had come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. And he came to them, so that because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for by occupation they were tent makers. He reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded both Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia, Paul was compelled by the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. But when they opposed him and blasphemed, he shook his garments and said to them, "Your blood be upon your own heads." Your own heads. I am clean, for now I will go to the Gentiles. He departed from there and entered the house of a certain man named Justus, one who worshiped God, whose house was next door to the synagogue. And Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his household, and many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed and were baptized. Now the Lord spoke to Paul in the night by a vision. Do not be afraid, but speak and do not keep silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to hurt you, for I have many people in this city. And he continued there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. When Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat, saying, "This fellow persuades men to worship God contrary to the law." And when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of wrongdoing or wicked crimes, O Jews, there would be no reason why I should bear with you. But if it is a question of words and names and your own law, look to it yourselves, for I do not want to be a judge of such matters." And he drove them from the judgment seat. Then all the Greeks took Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat. But Gallio took no notice of these things. That seems like such an odd thing. They start beating this man, and the leader is basically like, whatever. I'm going back in and watch Matt Dillon. I don't know. All right, so we're talking about Corinth. I have a few pictures from Corinth. We'll just kind of flavor our study with. All right, this right here. Okay, so Corinth is built on an isthmus. The city is on an isthmus. I hope I'm saying that right. It's a body of land with water on either side of it. And I don't remember, I think it was like 7 miles across there or something like 5 or 6 miles across this isthmus. Now, in modern times, they've actually dug a canal where ships can go from one side from one body of water to the other. In ancient days, there was no canal. What they had was this paved road that they would haul ships. They actually had like slaves that would drag these boats like 5 miles or whatever it was. You can see the ruts in this pavement here where they would drag these ships across there. Just an amazing feat to actually drag a ship from one. Let me see that map again. They're dragging it from the Aegean Sea, and I think that's the Adriatic on the other sea. I could be wrong. But from one sea to the next. So just an amazing feat, I thought. All right, let's see what we got. This is ancient Corinth. What's left of it. This is where Paul would have been. If you look up on the horizon there, that very prominent structure, that's the temple of Apollos, Apollo, the god Apollo. And so, as you can see, idolatry was big in Corinth. Let's see what else we got. And there's a better picture of the temple of Apollos. All right, now this right here. So if you look where it says Paul was brought before the judgment seat and he appears before Gallio, they bring him before the judgment seat. This is where Paul would have been standing. Now, this is not a great picture because the actual judgment seat is kind of, you can see just the edge of it kind of in the right-hand corner, upper corner of the picture. But this is where Paul would have been. They would have brought him out here. In the video at the end, you'll see a much better presentation of the actual judgment seat. It's just a giant platform where the ruler would have sat and pronounced judgment. And apparently that's where he sat while they were beating up Sosthenes, and he did nothing. He just left. All right, I think that's all the pictures that I got for right now. All right, so let's talk a little bit about these verses. Paul he leaves Athens, he comes to Corinth. Now, things apparently go fairly well for him at Corinth, at least in terms of his length of stay there. How long did he stay there? year and a half. So that's pretty significant. He up till now he hasn't really been able to stay a great length of time anywhere. It's usually he comes in and he stays a little while, and then the Jews get the crowd, the city riled up, and they run him out of town, and he's on to the next one. But he's able to stay for a year and a half, so that's significant. Now, what does he do while he's there? Yeah, so he's a tent maker. He's supporting himself. He stays with Priscilla and Aquila, who are tent makers, which he's also a tent maker, and so he provides for himself. He makes a living by making tents. So, in addition to making tents, what else was he doing? Preaching. You better believe he was preaching. He was preaching, and he was helping to establish the church in Corinth. And so, and even today you'll hear reference to a tent-making ministry. Well, what that means is that you're not necessarily taking church funds to fund a ministry. You're going somewhere, and you're holding down a secular job of some sort to provide for your needs, and then you're doing what missions or ministry you can on a volunteer basis. That's a tent-making ministry. So it comes from Paul's occupation here in Corinth. Yes, ma'am. He was bivocational, yes. And sometimes he was totally volunteer. Although, now saying that, he makes reference in letters to getting love offerings from like the churches of Macedonia and things like that. And so he wasn't volunteer necessarily, but staying in Corinth for a year and a half, he's like, okay, well, I'm gonna have to do something to, put beans and cornbread on the table. And so tent making was a convenient thing since he already knew that skill. He knew, and he met some people that were also in that trade. So it worked out for him, a job and lodging. It worked out well for him. Now, he goes. Let's take a closer look at this. Verse 4. He reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath, which we've already said that's his standard method. He will get to a town, and the first thing he does is he goes to the synagogue if they have one, and he starts proclaiming to the Jews that Jesus is the Messiah. Usually, then what happens? Yeah, the Jews, basically run him out of the synagogue and eventually run him out of the town. That's what's happened up to this point. So he goes to the synagogue, and he's preaching Jesus, and he's persuading both Jews and Greeks, it says. And he's preaching, verse 5, that Jesus is the Christ or the Messiah. But look in verse 6. When they opposed him and blasphemed, now we can only assume that their blasphemy had something to do with the person and work of Jesus Christ. Then he shook out his garments and says to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I'm clean. I'm going to go to the Gentiles." So when he shakes his garments, what's that supposed to symbolize? Yeah, like shaking your dust, like I'm done with you, like you had your shot, and I'm done with you. And then if he's done with the Jews, where's he headed then? To the Gentiles. This was always his MO. He started in the synagogue with the Jews. Ultimately, the Jews would reject the message by and large. He would then turn to the Gentiles. So he's keeping true to form here. Either they were in in the synagogue, or else he witnessed to the Jews in the synagogue and the Gentile and the Greeks where he could find them. He says he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded both Jews and Greeks. You wouldn't think that the Greeks would be in the synagogue. So perhaps the idea is that he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews, and then he persuaded Jews and Greeks in his ministry. I wouldn't think that Greeks would be in the synagogue. Not that they wouldn't be allowed in the synagogue, unless they specifically came in to hear the message of Jesus, which that's possible as well. Now, we get in verse 7 that he departs from there and he enters the house of a man named Justus who worshiped God, and his house was next door to the synagogue. Why would he go to the house next door to the synagogue? Yeah, he's not done with them. He's not giving up on them at this point. He's still trying to reach the Jews, even though he's shook the dust from his garments, and he says, "I'm turning to the Gentiles." He's still not completely giving up on the Jews, and so he's going to get as close to the synagogue as he can, even if he's not welcome in the synagogue. Okay, I'm gonna get in the house next door to the synagogue, and I'm still going to try to reach you guys. Now, notice something else. Verse 8, then Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his household, and many of the Corinthians hearing believed and were baptized. So, he's having some success. It's not as though all the Jews have rejected. Some Jews have accepted, some Greeks have accepted, and significantly, which important Jew has accepted Christ? The ruler of the synagogue. So he's making some good progress here with the gospel. Now in verse 9, we're told that Paul gets this vision. He has a vision from the Lord who says, "Don't be afraid, but speak and don't keep silent. I'm with you, and no one will attack you or hurt you. I have many people in this city." So what do you think was the purpose of the vision that Paul sees here? Encouragement. Do what? Right. Don't be afraid. Encouragement. He gives him. It's a vision that gives Paul encouragement and strength. You know, what encouragement and strength can we find from Paul's vision here? It was a vision to Paul, but it speaks to us as well. Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Somebody else was saying something over here. Yeah, exactly. What? Keep on keeping on. You know, God is with you. You're not alone. That was the message to Paul. It's God's message to us as well. You're not alone. You know, I think it's easy sometimes to fall into the Elijah syndrome where we just want to go hide in a cave and, you know, cry in our own pity party. I'm the only one in Jerusalem that's serving God. You know, God says, you know, I've got, 7,000 that haven't bowed the knee to Baal. You know, we're not alone, you know. And I think that's one of the things that's so important about church, because church is where we can come and be reminded that we're not alone. We're in this together. And God will protect you. So don't be silent. That's the idea there. Now, I showed you the picture of the judgment seat Paul is brought before. Why do you think Gallio refused to hear the case against Paul? Yeah. He says, look, if this was something that really amounted to something, I'd hear you, but it's a question of words and names and your own law. Take care of it yourself. You think there's even maybe more to it as to why he didn't want to hear it than that? Huh? Possibly conviction. If he thought there was anything meriting punishment, do you think he would have heard it? So the fact that he wasn't willing to hear it, what does that tell you? Yeah, I mean, he did not believe there was any merit to the case. In other words, he didn't believe there was anything, he didn't believe there was a case. Now, what does this sound a whole lot like to you? Yeah, it sounds like Pilate, with Christ before Pilate to me. Pilate says, I'm going to wash my hands of this, and they say, his blood be upon us and on our children. Which, man, they spoke better than they knew, but it sounds very much like the case of Christ before Pilate here. So he didn't want to hear the case, probably because there was no case. Also, he probably didn't want to get involved. He saw two crowds of people. He saw the Jews who were stirred up and wanted Paul punished and gone. He saw another group of people who had believed the message about Jesus and was very pro Paul. So you had believers and unbelievers. You had Jews and you had Greeks, and Paul and Gallio saw this as a recipe for disaster, and he thought the best thing I can do is just wash my hands of it and say, take care of it yourself. Who does that sound like? Sounds like Pilate, doesn't it? Pilate's dealing with Jews and the followers of Jesus, and Roman law and questions of religion, and also questions of Roman law and who's the king. He asked the question, are you a king? And what is truth? I mean, Pilate, I'm talking about, asked these questions, and so we see basically the same thing here with Gallio. Now, why did the Greek... So we get this weird story about when Gallio refuses to hear the case of Paul, that the Greeks take Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat. And Gallio still takes no notice. Why would they beat Sosthenes? Huh? You think they just kind of got caught up in the moment? I'm mad, let's beat up somebody. Here's somebody, let's just beat him up, huh? Do what? So yes, sir. Right. 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 So it seems that they either do it because he is a believer and he's associated with Paul, and so being on the side that wanted Paul punished, then they said, okay, well, if you're not going to punish him, we'll do it ourselves. Here's a believer, bum bum bum. He's associated with Paul. We'll just beat him up. or it's done as an act against the Jews. In other words, if the Jews are speaking against Paul, and here are the Greeks, which would kind of be on the other side of the fence, then if they associated the ruler of the synagogue with the Jews, then it's possible they beat Sosthenes more in an attempt to defend Paul rather than to attack him. Now, beating up Sosthenes didn't help Paul any, but it's possible. So either one of those things, they either thought they were hurting Paul or they thought they were helping Paul by beating up Sosthenes. Neither one happened, and so he then heads down to Centuria. Let's see, verse 8. Let's look at verse 18. Let's look on to 18. So Paul still remained a good while. Then he took leave of the brethren and sailed for Syria. Now he's going home. Remember, Antioch, Syria is home base for Paul. So he's headed home. He sailed for Syria, and Priscilla and Aquila were with him. He had his hair cut off at Centuria, for he had taken a vow. And he came to Ephesus and left them there. We'll have a lot more to say about Ephesus in the third missionary journey, but here he just makes a brief stop. But he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews, and when they asked him to stay a longer time with them, he did not consent, but he took leave of them, saying, I must by all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem, but I will return again to you, and God willing. And he sailed from Ephesus. When he landed at Caesarea, gone up and greeted the church. He went down to Antioch, and that's where we're going to stop right there. Okay, so throw that other picture up there. Paul is leaving Centuria. This is Centuria. This is the remains of an old ancient church that was built at the port of Centuria. That's all that's left of it now. But you see the harbor heading out. That's where he would have sailed out. In your map, you probably should be able to see Centuria on there. Yeah, yep, you see it right there. It'd be on the eastern side there. All right. So he's headed to Centuria. He's going to catch a boat out, headed home by way of Ephesus. It says that he had his hair cut off in Centuria because he had taken a vow. Now we're not exactly told. We're not told exactly what vow it is, but what vow do you think he took if he had to cut his hair? Somebody say it. The Nazirite vow. The Nazirite vow, if you remember the story of Samson, Samson was supposed to be a Nazirite from the womb. He messed that up pretty good by the time his life was over with. But the Nazirite vow, generally it wasn't for a lifetime. Generally it was just for a period of time where you wanted to commit to extreme holiness, to devote that time to God. It involved three things, if I can remember what they are, and you all can help me remember. One is no haircuts. Can't cut your hair. You can't touch a dead person. Can't go touch any corpse. And no fruit of the vine. That's right. So these three things. So for however long Paul had kept this vow, it was now fulfilled, and he gets his hair cut, and he can have fruit of the vine again if he so chooses, or he could touch a dead body. Why in the world he would want to do that, I don't know. Although, maybe he wanted to raise somebody from the dead. I don't know, but anyway, he can do that now. Now, look at verse 21. Verse 21. He took leave of so he stops at Ephesus. They want him to stay with us a little while longer. He'll have longer stays in Ephesus, but this time he says, I can't. I must by all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem, but I will return again to you, God willing. Who does this sound like? I must keep the feast in Jerusalem. Sounds a lot like Jesus before the last Passover, before he was crucified, doesn't it? So, would you say Paul's ministry was a success or a failure in Corinth? Huh? He planted seeds. Well, you know I'm going to say it's a success because you can see my question lists some ways that you see Paul's ministry as a success. So, kind of giving you the answer, huh? They didn't run him out. Hey, he's getting better. They're not running him out. So he's just the length of stay itself tells you he's able to stay a year and a half. I've always kind of, well, I don't know if you can say that. I mean, you can't always say that, but to some extent, I've kind of judged the success of a ministry by how long you're able to stay someplace. We will have been here 5 years in October, so I mean that's not bad for the track record we've had in times past sometimes. But Paul's able to stay a year and a half, and compared to what he had, that's pretty good. He started a church there. This is he not only just reached some people and then left and hoped that the church would germinate and grow. He was able to actually stay a while and see it come to fruition, so that's good. And he reached some influential people, both Jews and Greeks, not the least of which was the synagogue ruler. So he had some success here. Now in verse 22, he lands to Caesarea. That's Caesarea Maritime. He goes up and greets the church, and then he goes to Antioch. And at Antioch, he's back at home base, which means what? The end of the second missionary journey. So the second missionary journey has come to an end at verse 22. And he's going to stay there for a little while, and then he's going to get, as missionaries often do, he's going to get that wandering fever again, and he's going to take off on another adventure. But he's going to be at home base of Antioch for a little while. Questions or comments on chapter 18 up to this point? All right, well, we have I think it's about an 8-minute video with our friend Dave Stott. And he's got